Hey there, Golden Bears. Good to see you again. It's our last module of time period 3, political parties in years of crisis. And let us dive on in. Telling a brief story of my freshman year at college. If you remember in a prior lecture, I talked about how I kind of changed how I look and dressed and kind of different people I hung out with based on musical styles, things that I like. But there was another friendship that emerged in my college years and living in the dorm and having opportunities to connect with people. And at my university, it was a small enough university where sometimes seniors would live in the dorms along with freshmen. And it was kind of a cool thing because, here they'd seen a lot of more experiences of life than we have, and they would give us impressions of what they were learning in their upper division classes. We were just a bunch of slappy freshmen just trying to make it through calculus and at 8 o'clock in the morning. And so it was a kind of a great experience for that. And it was there that I befriended a lot of unique people that gave me unique ideas. Some of them I've never even heard about before. Others I'm like, nah, I could kind of dismiss this. But what it developed is even though not all of us agreed, it did develop this organic friendship that stemmed from some common interests. Some of our common interests came from music. Some of our common interests came from the types of, fraternities or sororities we had joined. Some common interests were maybe your church affiliation or perhaps sports, and you played on the intercollegiate teams there. Numerous things played into that, but the only common denominator is that when you go off to college, most people don't have the luxury of bringing a group of friends with them or meeting them in kindergarten and going all the way through high school. Everyone starts from scratch, and everyone has to find a corner of which kind of to find and hang out with certain groups of people. This is where America was at the time. There were seeing different factions or group of people forming, and on one side you have, if you remember, the Federalists with John Jay and George Washington, and of course Andrew Alexander Hamilton, and leading the charge of the Federalists and the strong central government. And then we have the other side of the ring, the other faction, Thomas Jefferson, leading the faction of this anti-big government, states' rights, and farmer agrarian type of look. And so today we're going to be looking at these learning targets here. By the end of this module, you should be able to connect how the French Revolution influences the American political system and causes factions within there. We also then out of that see an emergence of a two-party system. And lastly, we see for the first time in world history a transfer of power politically from one mindset ideology to another ideology. And what lives and what goes on? The Constitution. The passing of John Adams' presidency to the passing of Thomas Jefferson. Completely different people, completely radical ideas, happens peacefully. A new lesson that I guess maybe to the rest of the world says that this democracy just might work. I want to review for you from prior lectures that what do the Federalists stand for and what do the Anti-Federalists stand for. You need to recognize that this is an important document, so I put it in there for you. But there's so many things that either side stood for that were totally counterintuitive. But you just remember this: Hamilton, Federalists, big government, big banks. Okay, very little. We can interpret the Constitution how we like. The Anti-Federalists are the Jeffersonians. Believe the farmers' middle class are the best class to listen to. Primarily, don't trust government. They want to, be involved with global things like France, but not be so beholden to them. They believe in personal rights over the rights of the government. So, quite interesting how they have still parallels to this day between the Republican and the Democrat Party. Well, a discussion that I'll do in a different time period, but it's just we need to recognize that the Federalist Papers were just exactly kind of what we're doing here today. Not today, but in 2020 or whenever you watch this video, that varying newspapers and media outsources, whether it be CNN to Fox Network, have a definite point of view of things. And so we think politics is nasty. We need to remind ourselves that these Federalist Papers that were posted Federalist 10, Federalist 51, they all had incredible meaning behind them, and they were posted and paid for and put in the newspapers for people to read to determine was it good to go from the Articles of Confederation, or as we call it, Articles of Confusion, to this new Constitution and eventually the Bill of Rights, etc. So again, America is splintered on those ideas between factions, and how should this idea of factions and disunity and tension be resolved? Well, the first area that we kind of need to be mindful of and be reminded of is that during this time we have George Washington running things. We have his good old boy Alexander Hamilton, we'll talk about here in a bit, running things. But we have this Thomas Jefferson who is still lingering in the background, incredibly frustrated with what Hamilton was doing. And he was agitating the Virginians and agitating the other farmers and agricultural people to kind of push back against what he believed would be beneficial for America, is to support what the French were doing over there. Why? They came to our defense when the moment of crisis was there. If you remember the Battle of Yorktown that helped bring about the end of the war and having Britain cave to this pressure, he's like, we should be joining them. Plus, we can send a lot of wheat their way, which will help us as farmers make some serious coin. So it wasn't all, purist and reasons and altruistic reasons. There were some other things going on. The other idea is that Jefferson believed in this egalitarian idea that all of us have equal opportunity, all of us have access. It's not about titles, it's not about how much money and what neighborhood you're from. And this is an ongoing theme that we see emerging in post-American Revolution that, as you can tell now, has kind of continued on through the American mindset. Well, because of this challenge, President Washington is like, no, we don't want to be involved with what's happening over there in Europe. We remember the 7 Years' War, and soon that turned into 20 different nations coming to battle. We don't want to be part of this. But Washington did a brilliant thing. He declares this proclamation that we're going to be neutral between the varying factions that are going on over there. But he also said that our treaty is tied to the people, not to the government. So this kind of gave them an interesting loophole that I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into Steger Select Group. But for right now, you need to recognize that the president played a brilliant move, that this was not meant for us to ever have to go into war, but only as a defensive way, the last-ditch effort if it was ever called upon us to do that. Well, Britain ignores this treaty. This is what gives them the opportunity to go and attack boats and disrupt the trading patterns that the new American colonists are trying to experience. And so what happens is the president sends over John Jay, one of our soon-to-be Supreme Court justices, or by now he might be a Supreme Court justice, and he's there to negotiate with the British so much. But many people feel that John Jay did not do that good of a job. In fact, after our treaty with Britain following the American Revolution, they were supposed to give up these 10 or 12 outposts that were along like that proclamation line from 1763 that, if you can remember, they were there hanging out for the fur trade and working with the Native Americans there. Well, they never left. And the Americans are saying, come on, when are you going to leave? John Jay goes over there. Hamilton basically, just kind of secretly kind of told the British what our plans were of the president, which is kind of a little trickery there, kind of conveys some of his hand at things, of his connection point. Jefferson the whole while is beating his chest the whole while, is saying, telling you they're going to sell us down the river. These industrialists in New England, these industrialists on the merchants, I mean, they're going to kind of sell us down the river. Let's be careful and cautious. John Jay comes back, and he has the weakest possible treaty signed, negotiated with the British. The British don't give up those forts. They, in fact, demand repayment of wartime damages during the Civil War. It's crazy what we came back with, and so this is certainly an agitation point that will become important to us here a little bit later. The second thing you need to know in this quick little sliver of factions, remember, new groups emerging, is there's this continued stress point, this stretching going on between the rural and the urban aspects of American history. We have the frontier farmers who are frustrated because this new guy, this Alexander Hamilton, who thinks that, he doesn't smell like the rest of us, he thought in one of his beautiful financial plans is, why don't we create an excise tax that will basically tax items so we can make money on this to repay loans and to pay out our debts? Kind of a cool thing. However, he went and attacked people on the interior, farmers. In fact, people who were growing corn and wheat that were converted into whiskey. So the poorest of poor. And so these farmers rallied against it to protest it. They blocked roads, they began burning buildings, we started doing all sorts of things. In fact, tar and feathering different people. See if I can show you an example of that. Here's a collector wearing that little hat there in the middle with his jars of whiskey that he's collected as contraband. You have farmers from behind him kind of walking up, seeing what's taking place. You have this little animal creature-like looking thing that is coming to take some of that percentage, all right, of that for his own gain. It's like a little fictional animal, like a little devil on his shoulder, if you will. And what is happening, those farmers capture the guy, put him over a barrel of whiskey and kind of tar and feather him and light the barrel on fire. This is what the rural people of Western Pennsylvania were willing to do. They were so frustrated with the government for what they had done that they needed to create some means to stop this madness of being overbilled and overcharged. What comes to the end of this and what brings to a conclusion is the strong central government under Washington and Hamilton freak out. They're like, we better do something about this. So what do? They send in but none other. No one else in the whole planet could have stopped this. I mean, Superman couldn't have done this. Schwarzenegger couldn't have done this. Orlando Bloom and all of his cuteness couldn't have done this. They took General Washington, and I think about 13,000 troops were collected and went down to this Western Pennsylvania town. And the moment these Whiskey Rebellionites saw George Washington in his 6'2" frame, they're like, we gone. Peace. We didn't mean to do this. We gone. Coolest thing is the president pardoned a few of them for what they were doing simply because he recognized that they're agitated state. What does all this mean? Is that the Constitution won. This also means that the strong federal government won. This also means that Washington and Hamilton and John Jay's idea of how a central government will take precedent over the states' rights, this won. And so, please know how the Whiskey Rebellion kind of helped trigger things. Now, I have a Shays example there, and all these other rebellions. We're going to be talking about that in my another Steger Select class a little bit later. Well, on the frontier, so that's kind of on the coastline and then a little bit in Pennsylvania. Now let's look at what's happening out on the frontier. It's not all that good there either. Please remember, the British are still chilling there. The Spanish are still down to the south. We have the American Indians creating a ruckus, of course, feeling threatened by what is taking place. And so essentially the Americans begin reaching out through this general, I forget his name, General Granville, I think is his name, but he's the one who signs this treaty. But there's another general that goes out and is kind of dastardly to the Indians. But as a bulldog, so to speak, he brings them to kind of the Miami tribe and brings this Miami tribe to some degree of compromise, and where both sides agree to come together and create this battle, this idea of compromise and a signed treaty. They call it the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and this was a continuation as more and more settlers kept moving in and heading west, that this necessitated some sort of agreements. So what was cool about this for the settlers is that they then get a huge tracts of land of Ohio and all of Indiana as we know it today. What's cool for the Native Americans is that they get paid $20 million and $9 million, I think it's $20 million, it's $20,000 and $9,000, for over perpetuity's sake, of this. Why is that important? It's for the first time that Native Americans actually have a treaty that is signed and money is paid and sovereignty is declared. Cool, but on the other hand, they gave up so much from them. At the same time, America signs a treaty with Pinckney, and which basically allows them access to the Mississippi, and the Spanish kind of retreat to their corners. But this gives America now unfettered access and peace along the ways that the Native Americans were creating problems, all the way up along the Appalachian Trail and into Ohio and Indiana. Now it has it covered all the way down to New Orleans, and this is quite a new thing. Well, in the last thing that we need to talk about is how these political party systems formed and what did this mean for them. President Washington is recognizing that these political parties are bad. He's also recognized that he's kind of ran the equivalent of 2 terms, and he's kind of saying, I'm kind of over this. We've managed to stay away from problems in Europe with a neutrality treaty. We've managed to create treaties and brought about solutions with Spain, with England, and now with the Native American tribes. He's like, I'm done here. Drops the mic. He's ready to walk off the stage, so to speak. Okay. Well, we need to recognize that because of this, there's a new election that's going to be held in 1796, where you have Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr are running on one hand, and you have John Adams and Thomas Pinckney for the others. You say, wait a minute. How did John Adams get there for the Federalists? Where's Alexander Hamilton? Please remember, by now, a ton of people are starting to hate Alexander Hamilton. Most of the Jeffersonians, and especially what he's doing about these excise taxes that hurt the farmer, the tariffs that hurt the merchants, all sides are being pinched on this, and so his name was left off the ticket, and this kind of moved forward. You can see in this map here that what made this election of 1796 so unique is that America is completely splintered in half. You have the Democrat Republicans to the south, you have the Federalists to the north, and it basically goes down to an electoral college vote. You can see there on the screen who won and who didn't. And during this time, in the early years, the second person with the most votes was the vice president. And this is pretty kind of a cool idea because it helped the balance of government. It might have slowed things down, but it gave you divergent opinions rather than a bunch of president and his cabinet who all say the same thing at the same time. I'll talk about that later. So as this two-party system unfolds, our government has to kind of continue to figure out what's happening and how do we handle what's taking place over in Europe. Well, John Adams in his new presidency is like frustrated that the British and the French aren't respecting our political agreements that President Washington had done. Adams tries to negotiate these losses of various things. He sends over these agents to France, and our American agents encounter 3 people that they're not named. And these 3 people, called the XYZ, promise a meeting with the high official in France that really can bring this meeting to a close. This war that America, that between the British and the French were having, that was causing problems for America. And in this, it became known that America's like, what? We're going to pay a bribe so we can go meet with this guy? And we still maybe get no court of treatment or nothing could be achieved? They says, are you kidding me? We're not going to do this. Came back. And America kind of really liked the aspect that we had a president who stood up for the right and the recognition that just because it's Europe doesn't mean they can get away with that type of cultural bribery, if you will, to do this. Well, France is prohibited from trading with us and allowed American ships to begin kind of creating problems against France for their unwillingness to sign a treaty with us. So during this war, the president, John Adams, takes it upon himself to begin passing various acts that attack the same people who love and worship Thomas Jefferson and the agricultural movement and the rights of the person and small government. Remember all these things? You have the Alien Sedition Acts that basically said, yeah, if you speak out against the government, or if you speak out against Mr. Adams, you speak out anything that we do, we can boot you out or we can arrest you. Okay, basically that's arresting. And then the Naturalization Act said certain people groups, especially if they're France, we have the right to boot them out. This didn't go over too well, and you can see here are some people fighting it out in the Congress here, based over these ideas of the Sedition Act and the Naturalization Act there. So what does this do? It only further divides up the country into the North versus the South, or the merchant versus the working class or the immigrant people. And this is what kind of causes the Democrat Republicans under Thomas Jefferson to meet together and secretly create these resolutions. And these resolutions are basically brilliantly argued, hearkening back to Greek thought, hearkening back to Roman traditions. And they essentially say, since these ideas are not respecting our Bill of Rights, especially the First and the Second Amendments within the Bill of Rights, we call these alien seditious acts void and of no force, and we can keep speaking as freely as we want because the federal government can't tell us what to do, especially when it comes to issues of free speech and issues of the right to freedom of expression. And so this leads to an election the next year, not the next year, but in that next election cycle. And so even though Adams has negotiated some things and the Federalists had made some changes, boy, there was not enough people who believed by it. And we have our first election of 1800 where it is called a peaceful revolution. And this is where we see the French Revolution finally coming to an end, the Reign of Terror coming to an end. We see a return to peace. We see Thomas Jefferson recognizing that those same values of life and liberty and equality are important that the French Revolution have. And so they use that same rhetoric Tom Jefferson did, and they find themselves tying in office. And they have to have the representatives vote on that. It's where Alexander comes to power, and Alexander votes not for his own side, but he votes for Thomas Jefferson, which basically is again and again and again represents the first peaceful transfers of political power from one faction to another. And these factions, trust me, completely looked different at almost every topic across the political sphere. Just like what it's like today here for you and I in contemporary America. So to summarize, you can see that America was debating the power and the scope of the federal government, where you have states trying to determine that they have rights and don't have to be subservient to that of the federal government. You see these two political factions beginning to compete against each other, with the Hamiltonians called the Federalists, and then you have the Jefferson known as the Democrat Republicans. So with that, I just thank you for listening in. Thank you for we end at time period 3, and you know what? Keep it classy, Golden Bears.